Love. What comes to mind when you hear the word love? Jesus asked Peter 3 times, "Do you love me?" And Peter thought he knew love. We hear, love our enemy, love our neighbor, don't love the world, love God. Do we know love? The world tells us how to love, but Jesus teaches us what real love is.
So, just a quick recap on our series, the Love Rated R. I know every time we see Rated R, it gets exciting. So, I'm excited. And so, Love Rated R, and the reason we labeled it that is because we want to talk about what love actually is and what love really means, right? Because that word's thrown so effortlessly nowadays, right? And so, just a quick recap on our love series. Gilbert started it off with false spirits, and that's a kind of a churchy word, but basically all false spirits mean is that there's people groups and individuals and organizations that are raising their hands and saying this is what love is, and then there's other organizations saying no, that's not what love is, this is what love is, and this is what I think you should do when you love somebody. No, that's not love, or love this way is bad, or all of these things. So we have all types of people, including myself and including us, that we have our own opinion on what we think love is, but we actually haven't gone to God's word to see what it actually says. And so because of that, the word love has possibly lost its taste, because it's thrown around so effortlessly. And so last week, Gilbert touched on also too, as far as Jesus' love. And he used a big word. It's also a churchy word. It's called propitiation. And basically all it means, Gilbert did a great demonstration. It means that God is holding all your sin that you've ever done and that I've ever done, and he's holding it with one hand, and he offers the other hand, and he invites you into a relationship with him. And so that way you guys can walk together in real love. And not only does he do that, but he steps into that gap where we deserve all the punishment and we deserve to be sent to hell. And he steps in and he says, hey, I will take on all that sin so that way you guys and me can be looked at as a son and a daughter, right? And he could treat us perfectly, spotlessly, and blamelessly, right? And so that leads us into the verse this morning that we're going to be going in, and it'll be on the screens. And again, it's only 2 verses, but there's a lot that I really believe that God wants us to talk about just with these 2 verses. It's going to be in 1 John chapter 4. It's going to be verses 11 and 12. And so it'll be on the screen, and so I'll read it, and then we're going to dive into it. 1 John 11 through 12, it says, "Dear friends, since God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. And no one has ever seen God. But if we love one another, God lives in us, and his love is made complete in us." So what I really want to do is I really want to focus on the first part. Dear friends, since God so loved me in you. I really want to focus on that because in order for us to move to the next verses, we really have to understand this point. And I think too many times, and even myself, and I've seen this all over the place, is that when we get invited into God's love or we get invited into serving, we skip that first verse and we just go immediately into serving. We go immediately into that because we don't really want to address possibly the things that God's been trying to address in us, right? And so we have some unforgiveness in ourselves, right? And so that leads me into my first point, and it's very simple. It's love yourself, okay? Now, I know when I say that, it's like there's a lot of things that we could talk about loving yourself, right? Going to the gym, go get a fresh outfit, go get some nice shoes, right? And don't get me wrong, all those things are great. I love to do those things. And those things are great for physically feeling good about yourself and loving yourself. But I really believe that when God says that verse, "For God so loved you and me," he's trying to address something internally within us that he can only fix, right? And so it's simply called love yourself. And one of the things that I've noticed is that how many of us know that it's hard to love one another when we're dealing with some unforgiveness in ourselves? It's hard to forgive people when we have not yet forgiven ourselves. Because I think that in our society today that we have this forgiveness process kind of backwards. First it starts off, I've been harmed or someone harmed me. Then I harmed somebody because I repeated the process. So we first start off with I need to forgive that person. And I think we skip that second process of forgiving ourselves because we skip that first verse, "For God so loved me." And then what happens when we do that? When I do believe that we have to forgive the people that have harmed us, but at the same time, if we don't forgive ourselves for the things that we've done, we end up going out and serving, right? And we find our identity in helping others and serving others. And why do we do that? Because when we're not dealing with our own selves and we're not dealing with some own unforgiveness in our lives, and we start to serve others, it's very therapeutic. And it feels very good. because we begin to find our identity in that. And I want to tell you something, just in my own life. I've been doing ministry for 7 years. And there's been times I was on the mission field, and man, I was doing big clubs where we had an awesome team, we're serving, speaking, preaching, and I felt so worthy when I was out there. But when I was behind closed doors, I felt worthless. And the reason I felt worthless was because there were some things that I had done that I had not yet forgiven myself for, right? Because I skipped that first part of the verse again, because God so loved me, and instead I went straight off to serving. And so I want us to get that right. I believe that God is calling us first and foremost to forgive ourselves. There's a famous movie, and some of you may have seen it, and if you've seen it and you're younger than 18, I'm sorry, I apologize. I saw it when I was younger than 18, and I'm not promoting it, but I won't even name the movie, but I'll just say the excerpt from it, okay? And so there's two cousins, right? One guy is named Paco, and the other one's named Cruz, okay? And so towards the end of the movie, they're arguing with each other, right? Because Paco had harmed Cruz, right? He'd done a lot of things in his life, and it was basically Paco's fault, while the reason everything turned out the way that it did. And so Cruz is letting him know this, because Cruz is in a better place in his life. And so Cruz says, yes, it's because of you that everything happened. And Paco looks at him and says, wait, so you're actually saying that it's because of me that the way everything turned out? And Cruz gives him this look, and it's a reassurance that says yes, right? And Paco starts to cry. And Cruz grabs him by the arms and says, hey, man, it's okay. Like, I forgive you. And Paco immediately pushes him away and says, I don't want your forgiveness. And Cruz looks at him and he says this. He says, well, that's your problem, because you can't forgive yourself. You see, when we don't forgive ourselves, I'm going to tell you right now, it is nearly, if not impossible, to forgive others. And we forgive others without forgiving ourselves. We end up trying to find other things to fill that emptiness behind closed doors. And I'm going to tell you right now, it does not last. Not only was I on the mission field broken, because I was dealing with some unforgiveness in myself, but there's people sitting in this room that have served alongside at City Life, and they were also serving through their brokenness, but when they were behind closed doors as well, I could almost bet that they felt the same way that I did. So, I want to kind of give you some quotes that we probably all heard growing up, okay? And these quotes are, you'll probably most likely hear these quotes from individuals that possibly are dealing with some unforgiveness in themselves, okay? Basically, everything that I just said, I want to give you guys some quotes on what that would actually look like if people are trying to love people without forgiving themselves, okay? So here's some quotes. Again, this may hit home, so this is going to be hard. Okay, here we go. So we've all heard the quote, I would give them the shirt off my back if they needed it. That sounds noble. It sounds good. It sounds righteous. Yes, give the shirt off of your back. I would give my shirt off my back to a complete stranger, right? But how many of us know that that's actually comes from the Bible, okay? And so we take that verse. I believe that the evil one is taking that verse out, and he's placed it on each and every one. And he says, hey, if you just give your shirt off the back to anybody, you're loving people. You don't have to deal with anything that you're struggling with. Just give the shirt off your back and you're good. But if we go to that actual verse, the context of that is actually a revenge passage. So God is actually saying, hey, the person that has harmed you, and the person that you hate, and the person that hates you, I want you to give them the shirt off of your back. Changes it now, does it? So God is saying, no. I don't want you to just give the shirt off your back. I want you to give the shirt off of your back to the people that you don't want to, because I know that there's some unforgiveness in your heart. And not only do I want you to give the people that you love, but I want you to give to the people that have harmed you as well. But in order for us to do that, there has to be some forgiveness that we have to give ourselves for. Here's another one. And you hear this predominantly in parents, but I've heard people say that as leaders. I've heard people say this to siblings and stuff like that. I would just want to give them the life that I've never had. Again, sounds beautiful, sounds noble. I think it's great. I think it's something we should do, right? But if we look throughout Scripture and we look at some of the leaders that gave their kids everything and didn't discipline them, we saw how it turned out. David gave his kids everything they wanted, and they took the throne from him. And they actually tried to kill him. So you want to give them, and I want to give people everything I never had. So we had discipline, but I want them to have freedom. Sounds good, right? No discipline. I don't want them to have to go through that. I just want to give them freedom. I don't want them to have what I didn't have. We had struggles. I don't want my kids to struggle. I don't want those people to struggle. I don't want any of that to happen. We had to work at a young age, so I don't want them to work. I want them to focus on everything else besides that, because I don't want them to turn out like I did. Let me give you a quick example. My parents are sitting in the room and they won't mind that I share this. I was 16 and my parents gave me a car. Not only did they give me a car, they gave me a BMW. You could ask them after the service how that turned out. Both of my sisters worked for their car. And you can ask my parents how that turned out for them. It was completely different. Right? It was a let's give Don this, let's give Don that, and I didn't know what I had and I ruined it. But my sisters, they worked hard, they saved their money, and they struggled and they sacrificed and they bought their own car. And it turned out way different for them. I learned from my mistake. I have a beautiful truck now. So here's the last one. And this one I think has caused so much damage. I think this one is very dangerous. And again, it sounds good. And it's almost true, but it's not. Just follow your heart. Do what your heart tells you to do. I think when we do that, it leads to so much brokenness because we, as individuals, when we follow our heart, we're following our emotions. And how many of us know that our emotions change like the way that the wind does? Our emotions change like the Texas weather, right? It's hot one day, it's cold another day. Right? Just follow your heart. And Jesus actually has something to say about that. He says this, he says, I want to reassure you, when your heart condemns you, God is greater than your heart and everything. Now, what is he saying there? It's not if when your heart wants to punish yourself. It's not if or we might think that your heart will condemn you. No, it's whenever your heart condemns you, you have to understand that my love is greater than yours. So what does that mean? There's going to be some times when you don't want to accept forgiveness. There's going to be some times when you don't want to accept God's love. So you start to want to punish yourself. No, I deserve punishment. I don't deserve God's love. Jesus is saying that your heart will do that to you, but I need you to understand that I love you and my love is greater than that. And maybe there's some of us in this room who are dealing with that right now. Maybe that, hey, like I've done some things, I have forgiven those people, but I haven't even forgiven myself, and I've been out serving this whole time and it has not worked. And what happens? We attempt to love one another, and instead we create generational problems, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. I want to put some meat to that, okay? Let me give you a face to everything that I just said. My grandma Rita, she is in her 60s. And just last week, I asked her to share her story with me. She's the one of 8 siblings. And she lived in the Castellano Courts in the west side of San Antonio. I didn't know this. By the way, this is the first time she's sharing her story with me. She lived in the Castellano Courts, and from one day to the next, her life changed. Mr. Villarreal, which would be my biological great-grandfather, who I've never met, he was there, and my grandma was with her mom, and they were living in the Castellano Courts. And my great-grandma was in a very abusive relationship. Right? There's Grandma Rita, and there's Gabby, which would be my great-grandma. Gabby was in a very abusive relationship as far as verbal abuse, because my great-grandpa, Mr. Villarreal, was an alcoholic. And so Gabby, which would be my great-grandma, started to realize that this was not healthy for her family, so she started seeing another man, and his name was Henry. And so one day, Henry shows up to the door while Mr. Villarreal is at work, and my grandma answers the door. And Henry says, hello. And my grandma says, who are you? He says, I'm a very rich man, and I've come to take you and your mom away. She's puzzled. She goes back to her room, and Gabby is packing all of their clothes. Within hours, all their stuff is ready, and they're ready to travel and leave the city. As they walk out the back door, Mr. Villarreal walked to the front door, and that was the last time that my grandma ever saw her dad. 2 of her brothers actually stayed behind, and that was the last time she was going to see them. Because by the age of 18, they had already died. So my grandma, this is the first time she's telling this story. She never grieved that process. She never got to say goodbye to those loved ones. And she grew up without a father figure. She was a victim of abuse. Then my dad gets pregnant with me at 15. So already feeling like a failure. she's doing the best that she can and trying to love people the best way that she can. And how does she do that? Giving, serving, not even realizing that God is interested in her story and he wants to bring healing. And she's in her 60s and she barely realized this week that God is interested in giving her an opportunity to say, hey, I remember your story and I love you and I want to bring healing. And there is some unforgiveness that my grandma is dealing with. And I looked my grandma in the eye. I said, Grandma, you never got to say goodbye to your dad. And she looks at me puzzled with tears in her eyes because it's the first time that she realized that she never got to say goodbye. It's as if that memory was just trapped in her brain and it never came out. And so she was trying to give all of these love efforts that were broken. And now my grandma is a wonderful, sweet lady. And she's awesome. She's a wonderful grandma. But I say that to say is that when she's dealing with some unforgiveness, she was dealing with it with her whole life. And she's barely realizing that God is interested in bringing healing to that. And so why do I say that? Why do I give you this story? Because I want to tell you something. And again, I'm going to be very repetitive. When we don't realize that God is interested in us more than he's interested in what we can do for him, that relationship with him, it'll be fake. As I talked to my biological father when he was there, he was at a funeral. I was at a funeral this week. And I told him, hey, I understand and I forgive you. And you know what he tells me? He says, I'm trying to make up for it with Darian, which would be my half-brother. You see, when we don't deal with the forgiveness that we need to give ourselves, we try to make up for it by doing other good things because we think that if we do all of these good things, that it will somehow purify us and bring healing in our own selves when God is saying, hey, whoa. You don't have to make up for anything. I just want to love you, and I want you to know that you are my son and that you are my daughter. And I want you to know that I forgive you. So if you understand that I forgive you, you can forgive yourself. And when you forgive yourself, you're more likely and inclined, and joy comes to your heart when you're able to forgive those who have harmed you or who have hurt you or who you have hurt. This is why God puts so much emphasis on love me first before you love people. This is why God says this in the verse that we just read, for God has so loved you and me. And if we miss that part, we go out and we serve and we try to love people, and we like to do what I call love efforts that are broken. And they don't last. So God puts so much emphasis on this, on our relationship with him. Why does he do that? Because he understands that there's going to be some things that we're going to get ourselves into that's going to break our hearts. And we're not going to want to serve people, right? We're not going to want to do the specific things or the things that he's calling us to do. Instead, we're doing things that we think we should do, and it's not what God's asking us to do. And then we wonder why there's so much division. We wonder why there's so much opinions, right? There's so much he said, she said, well, they said, well, we said. And then we get people bickering and in opposition with one another because of the little child that they haven't forgiven, like which would be themselves, has grown up and they're still that little child and they haven't dealt with that unforgiveness. So it's all the symptoms of trauma, just fighting one another. Because no one has ever come alongside and said, hey, what's your story and what happened to you? And I want you to know that God wants to forgive you. But we need to forgive ourselves. Because when God offers that forgiveness, what do we tell him? I don't want your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. It's an oxymoron when we don't want to accept God's forgiveness, but yet we want to forgive others. That doesn't make any sense. So I want us to go into the last part of the verse. It says this: so since God has loved you and me, we also ought to love one another. It's not a recommendation. It's not I think you should. It's, hey, this is the expectation that needs to happen whenever you come to follow me and you realize how much I've forgiven you. This is the expectation. You ought to love one another because watch this. When you do this, no one has ever seen me, but when you do this, they will see me and my love will be complete. You see, God's asking us to do this. He's asking to do this because there's going to be lost people that don't believe in God and they don't want nothing to do with God. And they're going to ask you, I can't see him, I can't smell him, I can't taste him. And they would be right. But the only way that they could see God is when you pursue them and you're consistent in their life and you're constantly showing them the love of God. And it's also for brothers and sisters in Christ who were following God, but they fell off or they think they're too bad or they're ashamed of the things that they've done. And God is calling us to say, hey, I want you to reach out to them and I want you to continue to forgive and love them so hard that when they come back, that even though they haven't physically seen God, that they're seeing Jesus through the way that you are loving them. And so I want to wrap it up with this. When I began to, as I was talking to my grandma towards the end, she is now on the road to being not only forgiving others, but to forgive herself. Because you know what? She was trying to make up all of the trauma that she had gone through and all the things that she had done and all the problems that she put herself in. She was trying to make up for it by just being the best grandma. But little did she know that God had been telling her, hey, you're my best daughter. You're my best daughter, and no matter what you do, that will not change. You're my favorite son. You don't have to make up for anything. And so now my grandma is on the road to now forgiving herself. And watch this. When you forgive yourself, you begin to forgive others, then you love others. This is what God means when he says, hey, when you do this, my love is made complete. It is complete in yours and in my lives. So I want to offer out the challenge. Who has God been calling us to love? And why has he been asking you to do that? Who has God been calling you to love? And why is he asking you to do that? And what is causing you not to do that? Not to go and love that person? What are some things that you have not forgiven yourself for? I'm glad you've forgiven others. But it's a broken effort if you have not forgiven yourself. Because if love is not costing you anything, then it's not real love. I know that sounds harsh, but it's true. If love is not costing you anything, if love is not causing you to sacrifice, then it's not real love. It's what we think love is. So what have you not forgiven yourself for? And let God heal you through that. Because I think we focus on a lot of healing from what's been done to us, but I'm starting to realize that we actually need healing from the things that we've done. We may have to call some people and say, hey man, I'm sorry. I didn't mean that. Hey, we did this, I'm sorry. You're worth more than that. Who is God calling you to love? Why is he telling you to do that? And what are some things that God is asking you to forgive yourself for because he's already forgiven you for that? Just pray and we'll be done. And I hope that today that it sparks a conversation. That when we go home and we talk to our loved ones, that we will begin to talk about, hey, are we really loving one another the way that God is asking us to? Mm-hmm. Father God, Lord, I just want to thank you for being here this morning. And I ask that as we leave this place, God, that you would begin to spark a conversation, that you would press on our hearts to simply ask questions, realize some things that maybe we need forgiveness for, that we've done. And God, who is it that you're calling us to love? And have we counted the cost? Because to love us, it costs you your life. And we thank you for that, and we come humbly before you, and we thank you for showing us perfect love. We ask it in your precious name.